What if the most powerful prayer was never a prayer at all? What if, hidden beneath centuries of doctrine and ritual, there was a practice so pure, so direct, that those in power worked tirelessly to erase it from history, not because it was dangerous, but because it was liberating? Drop a in the comments right now if you've ever felt like something was missing from the way you were taught to connect with the divine. And if this video makes you see something in a new light, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people find this kind of content. Here is what most people were never told. Jesus of Nazareth, teacher, mystic, revolutionary, existed in a world buzzing with hidden schools of thought, wandering sages, desert contemplatives, and esoteric brotherhoods who believed that the path to the highest truth wasn't found in temples built with human hands. It wasn't found in petitions sent upward into an empty sky. It was found within, in the silence beneath all silence, in the still point that some called the monad, the one, the infinite, the source that has no beginning and no end. The Gnostics, early seekers who claimed access to a deeper layer of Christ's teaching, spoke of a cosmos far stranger and more layered than most people imagined. They described a reality where human souls were like sparks of divine light, trapped not by sin alone, but by forces they called archons, cosmic gatekeepers, architects of illusion, entities whose very design kept consciousness small, distracted and obedient, and they believed Jesus knew exactly how to move past them, not through ritual, not through repetition, but through direct contact with the monad, the calling, the inner turning, the act of recognizing what you truly are beneath every layer of fear and forgetting. This video is about that practice, where it came from, what it actually means, and how in a world more distracted than ever before, it might be exactly what the searching soul needs to hear. Stay with me. This goes deeper than you think. To understand what Jesus may have known, we have to travel back, not just to first-century Palestine, but to a world saturated with competing visions of reality, consciousness, and the divine. The ancient Mediterranean was not a single faith world. It was a crossroads. Greek philosophers, Egyptian mystery schools, Jewish mystics, and wandering teachers from the East all mingled their ideas in the great intellectual melting pot of that era. And at the center of many of these traditions was one extraordinary idea, that behind everything visible, behind every god, every force, every name given to the sacred, there existed something that could not be named, something so absolute, so foundational, that even calling it God felt like a reduction. The Greek philosopher Plotinus, building on the legacy of Plato, called this the One. It was not a being among beings. It was the ground from which all being flows, like light from a sun that never dims, like silence from which all sound is born. You could not worship it the way you worship a king, because it had no preferences, no ego, no need for praise. You could only return to it. You could only remember it. The Gnostics inherited this vision and wove it into their understanding of Christ's secret teachings. In texts like the Gospel of Thomas, discovered in the Egyptian desert in 1945, Jesus speaks in ways that feel strikingly different from mainstream scripture. He says the kingdom is not coming from the outside, it is already here, spread across the earth, and people simply do not see it. He points inward, relentlessly. He speaks of knowing oneself as the doorway to knowing the all. This was not accidental language. It was the language of the monad, the one source, rendered in human terms for human hearts. But the Gnostics also described something darker. They taught that between the human soul and the monad stood layers of reality governed by lesser forces. These were the archons, a word meaning rulers or authorities in Greek. They were not necessarily evil in a simple cartoon sense. They were more like filters, distortions. They represented the forces of ego, of fear, of mechanical thinking, the inner and outer voices that keep a person small, reactive, and unconscious. In Gnostic cosmology, the material world itself was shaped by these forces, not created by the highest source, but by a kind of lesser craftsman, what they called the demiurge, who built a world that looked real but was only a shadow of the true light. Now, whether you take this literally or symbolically, the psychological insight is breathtaking. How much of human suffering comes from identifying with the noise rather than the silence, from obeying the fearful voice in the mind rather than the quiet certainty beneath it. The Gnostics were mapping something real, the inner architecture of a distracted, conditioned human being, and Jesus in their telling was the one who had found the way through. not by fighting the Archons, not by condemning the world, but by making direct contact with the deepest ground of existence, the monad, and showing others the way home. That practice had a name, and it was far simpler than you might expect. The word prayer carries centuries of weight. For most people, it conjures an image. Hands folded, eyes closed, words sent upward toward a distant deity who may or may not be listening. A petition, a plea, a conversation with something fundamentally other than yourself. But what the Gnostic traditions preserved, what certain early mystics whispered to one another in hidden rooms and desert caves, was something categorically different. They called it the monad call. And to understand it, you first have to understand what the monad actually is. The monad is not a god you approach. It is not a being seated on a throne at the edge of the universe. In the language of ancient philosophy, the monad is the absolute singularity from which all multiplicity emerges. It is the one before the many, the silence before the word, the light before the flame. Every tradition that has touched genuine mystical depth has pointed toward it, sometimes calling it the Tao, sometimes Brahman, sometimes Ein Sof, sometimes simply the ground of being. And here is the insight that changes everything. You are not separate from it. This is not a metaphor. This is the central claim of the Gnostic path, echoed across Neoplatonic philosophy, early Christian mysticism, and the contemplative heart of nearly every wisdom tradition on earth. The spark within you, what the Gnostics called the pneuma, the divine breath, is not a copy of the monad, not a reflection of it. It is it, temporarily clothed in matter and memory and the noise of a conditioned mind, but never actually severed from the source. So the monad call is not a prayer to something. It is a remembering of something. It is the soul turning its attention back toward what it has always already been. Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas says something that sounds almost shockingly direct for a religious text. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. This is not the language of petition. This is the language of recognition, of uncovering, of calling forth the divine that was never truly hidden, only forgotten. The monad call works on this principle. It is an act of inner orientation, not outer supplication. Think of it like this. Imagine you are a wave on the surface of the ocean, and for your entire life, you have believed yourself to be only the wave. You have ridden high and crashed low, celebrated your peaks and mourned your troughs. You have prayed to the ocean as though it was somewhere else, somewhere distant, somewhere you must earn the right to reach. And then, in one moment of absolute stillness, you realize you were never only the wave, you were always the ocean, moving. The monad call is that moment of realization, intentionally cultivated, deliberately entered, returned to again and again, until it becomes the ground of your entire way of being. Now here is where the Archons become relevant in a deeply practical way. Because the moment you begin to turn inward, the moment you attempt to touch that silent depth, something happens. The mind resists. Thoughts crowd in. Fear surfaces. Old stories replay themselves. Distractions multiply. Ancient Gnostic teachers would say this is not random. This is the archonic principle at work, the mechanism of the conditioned self fighting to maintain its grip on your attention. Every tradition that has ever taught serious inner work has encountered this same phenomenon. The Buddhists call it the monkey mind. The Stoics called it the passions that cloud reason. The Gnostics called it the Archons. Different names, one experience, and the monad call was designed precisely and elegantly to move through it. There is a moment in the Gospel of John that most readers pass over without a second thought. Jesus withdraws, alone, into silence. Again and again throughout the Gospels, this pattern repeats itself. He retreats from the crowd, from the disciples, from the noise of the world, and enters into something wordless and still. The Gospels call it prayer, but the Gnostic interpreters of these texts asked a different question: what was actually happening in that silence? Because if Jesus was communicating with the monad, with the absolute source that has no ears to hear petitions and no throne to receive visitors, then what he was doing looked nothing like conventional prayer. It looked far more like what the Neoplatonists called henosis, union, the deliberate dissolution of the sense of separation between the individual spark and the infinite flame. This is the deeper meaning of the monad call. It is not a technique in the mechanical sense. It is not a formula you recite or a posture you adopt. It is a quality of attention, a particular way of turning the inner eye toward the ground of your own being and staying there long enough for the noise to settle and the recognition to arise. The Gnostic text known as Allergenes, one of the remarkable documents found among the Nag Hammadi library, describes this process with extraordinary precision. The seeker is instructed to withdraw attention from the external world, then from the stream of thoughts, then from the sense of being a separate self, until what remains is pure, undifferentiated awareness. And in that awareness, something is recognized, not learned, not acquired, but recognized, as though remembering a face you had somehow forgotten was your own. This is what defies the Archons. Not confrontation, not spiritual warfare in any dramatic sense. Simply this: when you touch the monad, the archonic forces, the fear, the compulsion, the unconscious conditioning have nothing left to grip. They feed on identification. They thrive when you believe yourself to be only the wave, only the thought, only the fear. The moment you recognize the ocean beneath, their power dissolves like shadows at noon. There is a beautiful paradox buried here that is worth sitting with. The Archons in Gnostic teaching are not destroyed by the awakened soul, they are simply rendered irrelevant. This is a profoundly mature spiritual insight, one that appears again and again across traditions. You do not conquer the ego by fighting it. You do not silence fear by screaming at it. You transcend it by discovering something so much vaster that the fear simply loses its authority. The monad call is the practice of returning to that vastness, deliberately, repeatedly, until it is no longer an experience you visit but a reality you inhabit. Now consider what Jesus said in the Gospel of Thomas when his disciples asked where they should go to find the kingdom. His answer was startling in its simplicity. It is inside you and outside you, not in the temple, not in the scripture alone, not in any external authority, inside and outside simultaneously, which is exactly what you would expect someone to say if they had genuinely touched the non-dual ground of the monad, where the boundary between inner and outer has ceased to be absolute. This is the secret that certain powers, whether we understand them as literal cosmic forces or as the very human institutions that benefit from keeping people spiritually dependent, have always found threatening. A person who has touched the monad needs no intermediary. They need no gatekeeper. They carry the source within them, accessible in any moment, in any place, under any circumstance. That is not a comfortable truth for any system built on spiritual hierarchy. And it is precisely why this knowledge was buried, fragmented and scattered, preserved only in the margins of history, waiting for those with eyes willing to look. All of this, the monad, the Archons, the Gnostic cosmology, the secret of what Jesus practiced in silence, can sound magnificent and yet utterly distant if it remains only philosophy. So let us bring it down, into the body, into the breath, into the ordinary moments of an ordinary day. The monad call is not reserved for mystics in desert caves. It never was. Its entire power lies in its accessibility, because the monad is not somewhere you have to travel to. It is the ground you are already standing on. The practice is simply learning to feel that ground beneath your feet. Begin with stillness, not the forced stillness of someone trying very hard to be calm, but the natural stillness that appears when you stop adding noise to the present moment. Sit quietly, close your eyes if that helps. Take a few slow, deliberate breaths, not to achieve anything, but simply to signal to the nervous system that this moment is safe, that you are not running, that you are arriving. Now, instead of forming words, instead of constructing a request or a confession or a gratitude list, simply turn your attention inward, not to your thoughts, not to your feelings. Beneath them, imagine your awareness as a hand gently moving through water, sinking past the surface ripples, past the currents of thought and emotion, down toward the still and silent floor beneath everything. This is the direction of the monad call, not upward and outward, but inward and downward, into the deepest stratum of your own consciousness, where the personal story grows quiet and something wordless and luminous begins to make itself known. You may not feel anything dramatic at first. That is perfectly fine. The Gnostic teachers were clear that this is not about generating peak experiences. It is about cultivation, the slow, patient excavation of your own depth. Each time you sit and turn inward, you are reinforcing a new orientation. You are training the attention to recognize its true home. When thoughts arise, and they will, because this is what minds do not fight them. Remember the Archons. Remember that resistance feeds them. Simply notice the thought, release your identification with it, and return. Again and again, with patience rather than frustration, with curiosity rather than judgment. There is also a practice you can carry into daily life. Throughout your day, in the small gaps between activities, waiting for coffee to brew, sitting at a red light, pausing before a conversation, take one conscious breath and ask yourself silently, what is aware right now? Not what am I thinking, not what am I feeling, but what is the awareness itself that holds all of this? That question is a doorway. It points attention back toward the witnessing presence, the part of you that watches thoughts without being the thoughts, that feels emotions without being consumed by them. This is the nearest you can get in ordinary waking life to touching the monad in motion. Over time, something begins to shift. The archonic noise, the anxiety, the compulsive thinking, the sense of being perpetually behind or not enough, begins to loosen its grip, not because life becomes easier, but because you have found something beneath life's turbulence that remains unshaken. That unshaken place is what Jesus pointed to. It is what the Gnostics called the monad. It is what every genuine mystic in every tradition has ultimately been describing. And it has been inside you this entire time, waiting to be called. We began with a question. What if the most powerful prayer was never a prayer at all? By now, perhaps that question has transformed into something more personal, something quieter. Because the real invitation of everything explored in this video is not intellectual. It is not about adopting a new belief system or replacing one set of ideas with another. It is about something far more intimate than that. It is about coming home. The Gnostics were not a fringe curiosity of history. They were cartographers, mapping the inner landscape of human consciousness with extraordinary precision, preserving a wisdom that certain forces in every age have found inconvenient. And at the heart of their map was this singular luminous truth. The source you have been searching for has never been absent. The connection you have been longing for has never been broken. The silence you have been afraid to enter is not empty. It is the fullest thing there is. Jesus withdrew into that silence, again and again, not out of defeat or exhaustion, but because he knew what lived there. He knew that beyond the noise of the world, beyond the grip of every archonic force, inner and outer, there was a ground of being so vast, so still, so unassailably real, that nothing could threaten the one who had learned to rest in it. That ground is available to you right now, in this moment. Not after more study, not after greater worthiness, not after the world finally quiets down, now. The monad call is not a secret locked away in ancient libraries. It is the oldest knowledge in the world, written not in texts, but in the very structure of your awareness. Every time you pause, every time you breathe consciously, every time you ask what is aware right now, you are making the call, and the monad, by its very nature, always answers. If this video opens something in you, share it with someone who is searching. Leave your thoughts below. This community of seekers grows richer with every voice. And if you are ready to go deeper, the next video is already waiting for you. The path continues, and you have never been lost.